Well, that escalated quickly. The US president has gone from peace negotiations with Russia that strangely excluded Ukraine to lobbing personal insults at Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy.
Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal.
And the Ukrainian president, in response, has been treading carefully so far when it comes to Donald Trump, but he couldn't ignore this.
So unfortunately, President Trump, who we respect a lot, as a leader of the nation that we really respect, the American nation who supported us all the time, unfortunately, he lives in this disinformation space.
So where does this leave Ukraine? Where does it leave Europe if Donald Trump is basically echoing Vladimir Putin's talking points when it comes to this war and how to end it? And what does all of this mean for US allies, including Australia? I'm David Speers on Ngunnawal Country at Parliament House in Canberra. Welcome to Insiders on Background. Well, Vasyl Myroshnychenko is Ukraine's ambassador to Australia. He's been a passionate and effective advocate for the country. Amongst those trying to rally international support for Ukraine, he joins me now. Ambassador, thanks so much for joining us.
Happy to be back, David.
So let's talk about, firstly, as an ambassador, but also as a Ukrainian, how does it feel to hear the man in the White House, the President of the United States, say these things, plainly wrong, that Ukraine started the war, that Zelenskyy is a dictator? How does that make you feel?
We just have to look at the basics, and let's just roll back to where we were 3 years ago. And I was still in Kyiv when Russians invaded Ukraine, and those paratroopers landing in the outskirts of Kyiv were literally like 20-minute drive from the place where I live. And I was there with my family, with my daughter, she was 18, with my son, who was 5, waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning, trying to escape Kyiv. And I was not the only one. There were like lots of people who were trying to leave the city. Nobody could because it was a huge traffic jam. We all got stuck.
Panic, basically.
Yeah, it was panic because nobody really believed generally that they would actually come to Kyiv that fast, right? And it all happened very quickly. So we all know who started the war. Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014. Actually, on the 20th of February, they started the invasion of Crimea. 11 years ago, and then they came into the east of the country. Eventually, they killed 38 Australians on board of an MH17, and they started the war. This is what everybody knows it. And they felt emboldened by the reaction of the global community to that invasion because it was weak. Sanctions which were imposed were very weak, and everybody just continued doing business as usual with Russia. And this is what emboldened Putin to come back 8 years later, to come with a much bigger war at a scale that the world has not seen since the Second World War.
And I think that history is really interesting that you point to that, and we might come back to it, because if Putin gets away with holding the territory that he's taken over the last few years, will he be emboldened then, and what's next? But as for the US support, I mean, it's been solid over the last 3 years. I mean, this has sustained Ukraine's defence. So how does it feel to hear the US president now saying what he said this week?
Putin did not expect such a fierce resistance from the Ukrainians. Also, he didn't expect such a quick reaction of the global coalition of countries. And that coalition was rallied by US and Britain. And I'm very thankful that Australia reacted very quickly, stepped in and provided assistance to Ukraine. Certainly, we wouldn't be able to survive without that support. If we look at the all assistance that's been provided to Ukraine to date, 70% of that roughly 70% came from Europe. About
70%.
Yeah,
right.
Over 30%. I mean, the numbers came from the U.S. Of course, that was substantial and that was quite serious. And that helped us liberate 50% of the territory which Russians have originally occupied, and that helped us to defend ourselves. And we have, as a result of that, we have survived. And certainly, we rely on American leadership, we rely on European leadership, on the British leadership, to find a sustainable, comprehensive, and just peace, a peace that would be fair.
Do you feel, though, now abandoned by Donald Trump?
Not at all, because we all understand that for any peace deal, we need to have Ukraine in, because that's Russia-Ukraine war. and we need a buy-in. We need a buy-in from Ukraine, and we need a buy-in from the Ukrainian people. Ukrainian people have delegated their power and mandate to President Zelenskyy. By the way, his ratings are very high, popularity ratings.
Donald Trump says they're 4%, that he should have an election.
Survey that was released yesterday shows that support for Zelenskyy is 57%. And actually, over 2 days, it just jumped. I mean, it really has surged very quickly.
Really, this week?
Absolutely.
Off the back of what Trump has said.
It was, that was a reaction of the people. They felt that was kind of one of those moments similar to actually what happened in February 3 years ago, how people all got rallied and mobilized in support of their leader. The same thing has just now happened.
So Trump's wrong about the approval ratings for Zelenskyy. He's wrong about who started this war. Is he just sprouting Putin's talking points?
We are, in this game together, right? It's America, Europe, and Ukraine, and we need to figure out the way forward. We are very pragmatic. As you know, President Zelenskyy just hosted Special Envoy Keith Kellogg in Kyiv. They had very good meetings there. Keith Kellogg met all the military leadership, all political leadership during 2 days of his trip. He had a very
Did he acknowledge that it was Russia that started the war?
They had a very amicable meeting with President Zelenskyy, and that was quite productive. I mean, there is some progress there. And too early to release what was discussed because, as you know, any negotiations are very complex. And there are several tracks which are in place, and we just have to stick to those tracks and move forward.
See, listening to you, and that's a bit of diplomatic speak there, Ambassador, it sounds like you are very reluctant to have a go at Trump, to hit back at some of the clearly outrageous and wrong things that he has said this week. You want to keep those channels open, right, and keep the prospect of keeping the US in play. Is that right?
It's the reality of the world we live in, and for the past 80 years, thanks to American leadership, we've been able to have a very stable world. Except for some, there were some exceptions. But if you look at the world after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was that leadership that America had has actually been stellar, and America as a beacon of democracy,
but there's a big
as
question
a
mark
leader
over
of the
that
world.
Now, isn't there? There's a big question mark over that role.
And that's I think it's been, you've seen the Munich Security Conference, and I think the call that President Trump is making on Europeans to spend more money on defense is the right call. And I think that's a unique opportunity for Europeans to finally step up.
This is the theory that what this is really all about is getting the Europeans to step up in their defence spending and step up in taking greater responsibility for Ukraine. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, this is how we see it, and this is what the goal of the Trump administration is to see more involvement from Europe. And in terms of defense capabilities, investing in their defense and rallying around Ukraine, because we are all talking about Europe. Therefore, European involvement is a must in any negotiations, because we cannot be talking about security in Europe without Europe's involvement.
Absolutely. And is it enough? If the US were to walk away or significantly downgrade their support, you mentioned 70% of support has come from Europe. Presumably you'd like to see that increase, but will that be enough?
But you have to keep in mind that a lot of that money that was from Europe, that were used for procurement in America.
Yeah, buying American munitions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's impossible. No security in Europe at the moment is possible without America. That's the reason why we have NATO. That's the reason why we have transatlantic partnership, and that's already, and everybody's focused on that. And that's what President Macron is doing. He's rallying those summits within Europe, including the UK, discussing how we deal with that, what's next. As you know, Keir Starmer is going to Europe and this coming week, to Washington. To Washington. Also, there are lots of other meetings taking place and happening at the same time. And look, why it matters to Australia. I mean, because security in Europe has a direct impact on security in the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, and I want to come to that because it certainly does. In terms of the peace talks or the negotiations that have opened up, Pete Hegseth, the US Secretary of Defense, has said that it's unrealistic to think that Ukraine can join NATO or go back to pre-2014 borders. Is it unrealistic?
NATO accession or aspiration to join NATO is enshrined in Ukraine's constitution. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, we're a neutral country. The reason why we changed our neutrality, because we've seen the invasion. The reason Finland and Sweden joined, because they saw what Russia did to Ukraine. These two countries have been neutral, for most of the 20th century. And they have changed their position just because they've seen a threat from Russia. Russia is a key threat to Europe. Hence, countries who joined NATO during the past 20 years, they had one aspiration, one goal, just to get the security they need. So for Ukrainians, we believe it's the cheapest security guarantee that Ukraine can get. It's been a part of the Washington NATO summit, and it's what majority of the Ukrainians support. So if it doesn't happen now, we have to build NATO in Ukraine temporarily. And NATO in Ukraine means...
What does that mean? Explain that.
It means that it has to be strong military, well-equipped, well-trained, having all the right capabilities, air defense systems, long-range missiles. It has to be there. The strategic conventional weapons deterrent that has to be in Ukraine to serve as a guarantee.
But can you do that alone? You need...
We can't do it. No. We need America, we need Europe, we need everybody.
Yeah, you need either European,
yes,
British and
absolutely.
French, and likely US.
Absolutely. It's not possible without US.
Right.
And that's the reason how we are trying to actually make a deal with America. And that was part of President Zelensky's victory plan to Donald Trump when they met in September of last year.
It may not be necessarily NATO membership, but some sort of US security guarantee.
Exactly. Right. And as part of it was a deal where President Zelenskyy has welcomed Americans' investments into critical minerals and rare earth minerals. That was our idea, that was our proposal, which President Trump liked, and we currently working on the legal arrangement around that. As you know, the Secretary of Treasury was in Ukraine recently. He had a meeting with President Zelenskyy. We are now looking at it from a legal standpoint of view, because there are some sovereign rights which have to be taken into account. The Ukrainian constitution has to be taken into account.
That's on the table.
That's on the table.
What
absolutely.
about territory, though? Is there any willingness to give up territory?
Nobody, not a single Ukrainian president, will ever cede any Ukrainian territory. It's not possible legally. It will never happen. Just forget about it. It's nobody in Ukraine will ever accept it.
So Crimea off the table?
Off the table for Ukraine. I mean, it could be just occupied, as it has been occupied now for 11 years, Crimea, as well as other parts of Ukraine. We will see a situation like similar to the Baltic nations who were occupied by the Soviet Union. There will be a day when we'll get it back, but it's legally, politically, it's not feasible for any Ukrainian leader, be it Zelenskyy, be it the next president, whoever is going to come, to recognize and cede any territory to Russia.
So it may remain occupied by the Russians, but not ceded.
Exactly.
And some sort of security guarantee to the US, from the US, this is the most likely pathway through this as far as you're concerned.
It's what we have currently, and of course we have to be, that's just a situation we're in.
Okay.
But imagine, this is the situation is like, maybe it's difficult for Australia to understand, but imagine that Queensland is occupied, right? And you've been slaughtered in large numbers every day, and they offer you peace. Cede Queensland, and you'll get peace. What do? But the appetites are growing, by the way. There is Western Australia, which has lots of minerals. And the appetite may grow because, global population is growing. People need to eat. People need critical minerals. People need iron ore. And that's a problem we have, because Russians have occupied big parts of Ukraine, which are rich actually in mineral resources, which have oil and gas. This is all now under their Ukrainian occupation, but it's not even the resources or territory. We are fighting for the Ukrainian people. People under the occupation are seeing gross violations of human rights. People are tortured, raped, go through filtration camps. They are illegally detained. They are forced to accept Russian citizenship because they cannot do they cannot get any public services if they don't change the passport. Curriculum has changed. Ukrainians in the occupation are being recruited and actually sent to the front lines to be slaughtered as cannon fodder, because Russians send them first to get killed.
Yeah,
And this is what's happening. So how would you, if you were Australian, in a similar situation, how would you react to ceding territory in exchange for peace?
It's a very good question, and we certainly hope that that's not on the horizon any time. But it does bring us back to this region. What should we be thinking about in Australia? Because, of course, Trump's willingness to potentially cut a deal with Putin raises the question about how he's going to deal with Xi Jinping in China when it comes to Taiwan. How should we be thinking about this?
I would like to quote former Prime Minister Kishida of Japan. He said that Europe today is Asia tomorrow. And I disagree with him because Europe today is Asia tonight. It's happening very fast. The question of sovereignty as a notion, which is enshrined in the UN Charter, has been broken. If a military power, which has nuclear weapons, can change borders by force, that actually creates a precedent for others to follow.
Well, particularly if the man in the White House, the US president, is okay with that happening.
Look, might is right. You have the power, you can do it if you're strong enough. And that's very dangerous for Australia. And that's very risky. There is risk of that happening because aggression, which is rewarded, aggression, which is not punished, war crimes, crimes against humanity, which there is no accountability for, opens up a new world, a new dangerous world for everybody. Because, look, here in the Indo-Pacific, there are many tiny nations which only rely on the international rules-based system as a protection.
So how should our Australian leaders be responding to this? There has been very strong bipartisan support for Ukraine, that it was Russia that started this war. This is an illegal invasion and occupation. Anthony Albanese has been careful, though, in saying he doesn't want to give a running commentary on Donald Trump, but, restating Australia's position. Peter Dutton has said, well, Trump is dead wrong in some of the things that he has said this week. What do you make of the reaction you've seen here in Australia?
We're extremely grateful to Australian government and Australian people for the support that they have provided in the past 3 years. As you know, $1.5 billion in military, humanitarian, economic assistance so far. Last year, in Ukraine, we had Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles and Foreign Minister Penny Wong in 1 year. As you know, they don't visit Europe that often, but they were two senior leaders of your government were in Kyiv. Prime Minister Albanese assured me once he wins elections, he will go there. I'm sure if elections are won,
go there soon if he's back in office.
That's what he told me.
And Peter Dutton,
the same thing.
Were to win, right.
Absolutely, the same thing. Peter Dutton said the same thing. He will go to Kyiv if he wins elections. So I think Ukraine has never had such a great relationship with Australia as we have it now. And I think there is a reason for that. The reason is very simple. I mean, the concept of fair go, of fairness, I think everyone in Australia understands who is a bully, what is good, what is evil. It's pretty straightforward. There is no doubt about it. There is no discussion, no public discourse. Everybody is clear that Ukraine is David who is fighting the Goliath, and it's an existential war for us.
Would you like to see a stronger political pushback at Donald Trump, or can you understand the caution from the Prime Minister?
It's all understandable. We all are, smart people. We all live in the world. We understand how all the countries are interdependent, how everybody is depending on American security. We all get it.
Trying to navigate this.
We have to navigate
terrain.
it together, and it's, look, we're in this fight together. We're in the same boat. Australia, Ukraine, as you can see, we're in the same boat because we both have our dependencies. We unfortunately don't have any other alternative.
What about the idea of peacekeepers? I know the British Prime Minister has talked about that as a possibility to send British peacekeepers in. There's been a mixed take amongst other Europeans on that, but should Australia be thinking about that, be willing to contribute to something like that?
As you know, Australian Defence Forces are already providing training to the Ukrainians in the UK, and it's been for the past 2 years, more than 2 years. So there is already a contribution that ADF is making. We'll come to that question in terms of potential deployment. It's too early to talk about it. We haven't yet made any official requests because it's just only ideas which have been voiced by President Macron, by Prime Minister Keir Starmer, and there might be a time where we'll be asking about that. But I think it's too early. It's too early. We need to get ceasefire. We need to get armistice. We need to get peace. And all these three elements are very complicated negotiations. As we speak here, Ukrainians are being bombed by Russians. Ukrainians are getting killed. Missiles and drones come on a daily night. Just last weekend, Russians attacked the shelter over the fourth reactor at the nuclear power plant in Chernobyl, which is creating a very dangerous situation. It's extremely radioactive, and that drone has ruined parts of that shelter. And that shelter, we spent 10 years to build that shelter, €2 billion, and 45 countries have contributed to building the shelter. What kind of country are we dealing with? We're dealing with a dictator, the richest man in the world, who wants to rewrite a history, who is on his imperialistic conquest to subjugate a democracy. The only reason he wants Ukraine destroyed because he wants to revive this Russian empire. We've seen it, we've seen it before.
I can hear your concern and understand it. I want to also ask you about Oscar Jenkins, the Australian man who was fighting with Ukraine, but has been in Russian captivity. 2 videos emerged of him this week, looking frail. I'm curious why you think the videos did emerge this week. Why are we seeing this now?
Look, I'm very happy that Oscar Jenkins was he's alive, right? Yeah. It's been part of my life for the past 2 months. And I'm very relieved. I'm sure it's a relief for his family. And for me, as a Ukrainian, when I see somebody from Australia coming voluntarily, signing a contract with Ukrainian Defense Forces and going to fight for Ukraine, we admire such people. He's a hero for Ukrainians. And of course, when we learned that he was captured, we were very concerned. As you know, there are a number of Australians who were killed in action in Ukraine previously. And for us, of course, that he's alive means a lot. It means he can come back eventually. As you know, we're negotiating with the Russians our regular exchange and swap of prisoners of war. So we will be negotiating the exchange of Oscar Jenkins for the Russians we have in captivity who are detained. And he should be awarded and granted all the rights which are granted by the international law and Geneva Convention on the Customs of War. And of course, the fact that he is now in the media, he's become a household name for every Australian. And I think that's what Russians are doing. This is they will be releasing another video 2 weeks from now. It's now part of the political discourse and political life in Australia, because every time there is a new video, Prime Minister gets a question, and you can just, you're all smart people, why is it happening, correct?
Well, is it to put more pressure on the Australian government? We've got a couple of Russian spies that are being held in Australia, apparently. So is this what it's about, trying to get a prisoner swap there?
Yeah, probably. It looks like it. And I'm sure you have experts who can tell you more, who can come on a show and tell you how Russians are using their influence, malign foreign influence, to undermine democracies, to undermine different countries. We see it in Europe. We see it with the rise of far-right parties in Europe. This is, all this story about immigration in Europe, a lot of that was driven by Russia and their involvement and meddling into Syria. Because originally, when all those Syrians fled to Europe, that was what Putin wanted. And as part of his support for Bashar al-Assad, he wanted to see those millions of people going to Europe because he knew that it would empower far-right movements in different countries.
You think this was the plan all along?
Absolutely. That was planned.
To inflame the right-wing parties in
Absolutely.
Europe.
That was a positive externality that was pursued as one of the goals, apart from just saving an ally in Syria who provided access to the Mediterranean for the Navy base. That was a positive externality that Putin achieved, because he knew that those migrants will actually strengthen those far-right movements. And then with Russian invasion of Ukraine, over 5 million Ukrainians in Europe, that's again, that was additional, because Putin wants to dismantle the European Union from within. Do you understand it? Because if we see more far-right parties, we already seen that in a number of countries, when they're coming to power, what's happening. And dismantling the EU is one of the goals which Putin is pursuing. Because when EU is dismantled, Europe is weak. And this is what he wants to achieve. And we have to be very cautious, because this is what we are facing. We're getting into a very turbulent world. You know, nuclear non-proliferation is pretty much dead at the moment. Non-proliferation of conventional weapons is also dead. Everybody's buying weapons because everybody sees that actually there is no guarantee. If you're not armed properly, if you don't have the capabilities, your sovereignty can be violated. And it's something for Australia to ponder over and actually, see what's happening and actually, take it into account. What's next? What's your defense capabilities? Can you survive without American support? That's the whole point. And I think what we are seeing is just really unheard of. But this is where we are. And this is, unfortunately, the reality of the world.
Well, it is a difficult moment for your country. There's no doubt about it. And Ambassador, I do appreciate you spending some time to talk to us about what's going on.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for that. Now, if you've got any comments, any thoughts on this conversation, do drop us a line at insiders@abc.net.au. We'll have more on this on Sunday on Insiders. Hope you can join us then, 9 a.m. on ABC TV. Bye for now.